Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to discuss about who was Mendel. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk who gained posthumous recognition as the founder of modern science of genetics. He was born in a German-speaking family in the Silesian part of the Austrian Empire, today's Czech Republic. He lived with his parents and siblings and worked on a farm which had been owned by the Mendel family for at least 130 years. During his childhood, Mendel worked as a gardener and studied beekeeping. The house where Mendel was born is now a museum devoted to Mendel. From 1840 to 1843, he studied practical and theoretical philosophy and physics at the Philosophical Institute of the University of Olomouc. He also struggled financially to pay for his studies. Mendel entered the Augustinian St. Thomas Abbey in Brno and began his training as a priest. He was given the name Gregor when he joined the Augustinian friars, and Mendel also worked as a substitute high school teacher and also as a physics teacher. Mendel began his studies on heredity using mice. He was at St. Thomas Abbey, but his bishop did not like one of his friars studying animal sex, so Mendel switched to plants. Mendel also bred bees in a bee house that was built for him, using beehives that he designed. None of his results on bees survived, except for a passing mention in the reports of Moravian Apiculture Society. All that is known definitely is that he used Cyprian and Carnolian bees, which were particularly aggressive to the annoyance of other monks and visitors of the monastery, such that he was asked to get rid of them. Mendel, on the other hand, was fond of his bees and referred to them as his dearest little animals. He also studies astronomy and meteorology, founding the Austrian Meteorological Society in 1865. The majority of his published works were related to meteorology. In 1854, the abbot of the monastery, C.F. Knapp, authorized Mendel to carry out a study in the monastery's 2 hectares experimental garden, which was originally planted by Knapp in 1830. Mendel used the common edible pea and started his experiments in 1856. Between 1856 and 1863, Mendel cultivated and tested some 28,000 plants, the majority of which were pea plants, Pisum sativum. He experimented with seed shape, seed color, pod shape, seed coat tint, unripe pod color, flower position, plant height, etc. After initial experiments, Mendel settled down on studying 7 traits that seemed to be inherited independently of other traits. Those were seed shape, seed color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, and plant size. Though farmers had known for the millennia that crossbreeding of animals and plants could favor certain desirable traits, Mendel's pea plant experiments established many of the rules of heredity, now referred to as the laws of Mendelian inheritance. His experiments led him to make 2 generalizations: the law of segregation and the law of independent assortment, which later came to be known as Mendel's laws of inheritance. Law of segregation states that during gamete formation, the alleles of each gene segregate from each other so that each gamete carries only 1 allele for each gene. Law of independent assortment states that genes of different traits can segregate independently during the formation of gametes. Mendel presented his paper, Experiments on Plant Hybridization, at 2 meetings of the Natural History Society of Brno in Moravia on 8th February and 8th March 1865. It generated a few favorable reports in local newspapers but was ignored by the scientific community. When Mendel's paper was published in 1866 in Verhandlungen des Naturforschenden Vereins in Brünn, it was seen as essentially about hybridization rather than inheritance, had little impact, and was only cited about 3 times over the next 35 years. His paper was criticized at that time, but is now considered a seminal work. Notably, Charles Darwin was not aware of Mendel's paper, and it is envisaged that if he had been aware of it, genetics as it now exists might have taken hold much earlier. About 40 scientists listened to Mendel's 2 path-breaking lectures, but it would appear that they failed to understand his work. He was elevated as abbot of the monastery in 1868. After that, his scientific work largely ended, as Mendel became overburdened with administrative responsibilities. Mendel died on 6 January 1884 at the age of 61 in Brno, Moravia, from chronic nephritis. The profound significance of Mendel's work was not recognized until the turn of the 20th century, more than 3 decades later, with the rediscovery of his laws. Erich von Schirmack, Hugo de Vries, Karl Correns independently verified several of Mendel's experimental findings, ushering in the modern age of genetics. The 3 researchers, each from a different country, published their rediscovery of Mendel's work within 2 months' span in the spring of 1900. Mendel's results were quickly replicated and genetic linkage quickly worked out. Biologists flocked to the theory. Even though it was not yet applicable to many phenomena, it sought to give a genotypic understanding of heredity, which they felt was lacking in previous studies of heredity, which had focused on phenotypic approaches. The combination in the 1930s and 1940s of Mendelian genetics with Darwin's theory of natural selection resulted in the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology. Mendel's work was simply too ahead of its time, too contrary to popular beliefs about heredity. "My time will come," Mendel once said, but it was over 30 years before his work was appreciated, and today he is regarded as the father of genetics.